Daniel was the talk of Olakan village, but for all the wrong reasons. He was notorious for his reckless behavior and wild doings. His name was often whispered whenever trouble arose in the village. Goats, chickens, and sacks of yams would mysteriously vanish, and the villagers would only shake their heads and murmur, "It must be Daniel," they would say. Yet, no one dared challenge him directly. What protected Daniel from outright confrontation was not his wits or strength, but his father. Chief Ola, the village's powerful witch doctor, was a man whose reputation stretched far and wide. It was said that Chief Ola could summon rain in a drought or even command the skies to withhold their waters. His incantations healed the sick, and his curses sent the guilty into ruin. Even the elders feared him and respected his power. But even with all his power, there was one thing Chief Ola could not control: his own son. Daniel. Chief Ola's voice thundered one evening as his son strolled into the compound. "What foolishness have I heard about you again? Another theft? How many times will I warn you? This life of yours will end in ruin if you don't change your ways." Daniel leaned casually against the wall, shrugged. "Father, you worry too much. Nothing will happen to me. Don't you see? Everyone fears you. No one would dare harm me." Chief Ola's face darkened. "My power is not a shield for foolishness. The spirits are watching. One day they will demand justice and I will not be able to save you." "Spirits? What spirits?" Daniel muttered under his breath, waving dismissively as he walked away. Despite his father's warnings, Daniel continued his reckless lifestyle. Alongside his gang of misfits, he had become a nuisance to the village. They would steal livestock and goods, sell them in distant towns, and spend the profits on frivolities. What they couldn't sell, they roasted and ate at their hideout, feasting like kings on stolen goods. Daniel believed himself untouchable. Even when caught red-handed, his father's influence ensured his release. Each time, Chief Ola would advise him, and each time, Daniel would shrug it off. But one day, whispers spread through the village. Chief Danku, a wealthy and respected elder, had passed away after a long battle with illness. "Have you heard?" asked Toby, one of Daniel's closest accomplices, as they sat together one evening. "They say Chief Danku would be buried with his gold and diamonds." Daniel's eyes gleamed with greed. "Then why are we wasting time? We'll visit the mortuary tonight and take what's ours, before he's buried." The gang exchanged nervous glances. "The mortuary," one of them asked. "What if someone catches us?" Daniel waved off their concerns. "No one will catch us. We'll go at midnight, when everyone is asleep. Just think of the riches." Despite their unease, Daniel's confidence was infectious. By midnight, they had gathered their lanterns and set off into the dark. "Stick to the plan," Daniel whispered as they approached the mortuary. The mortuary stood outskirt of the village, an eerie building surrounded by dense trees that seemed to shiver in the cold night breeze. Its shadow loomed over them, as they crept in through the back entrance, avoiding the guard. Inside, the air was heavy, the smell of decay and chemicals stinging their noses. The group moved cautiously, their lanterns casting flickering shadows on the walls. Toby whispered, "This place gives me the creeps." "Focus," Daniel snapped. "We're here for Chief Danku." They searched row by row, pulling back the white sheets covering the bodies. Each lifeless face stared back at them, and each time, Daniel's heart raced. Finally, they found him. Chief Danku's robust body lay adorned with his diamond chain and gold watch, the jewels glinting faintly in the lantern light. "Jackpot," Daniel muttered, his hands trembling with excitement. The gang worked quickly, stripping the body of its valuables and stuffing them into a bag. "Let's go," one of them whispered urgently. But Daniel wasn't satisfied. "Let's check the others," he suggested. "There might be more." "Are you crazy?" Toby whispered harshly. "We've got enough. Do you want to leave with just peanuts?" Daniel snapped, moving to another body. The others, reluctantly, followed his lead, uncovering more bodies, stealing more items and valuables. As they moved toward the exit, a sudden chill swept through the room. The air grew thick, and an unnatural silence fell over them. Then, a voice echoed, deep, menacing, and unmistakably angry. "Return my property." The voice was deep, hollow, and unnaturally loud. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls and shaking the air. Daniel froze mid-step, the bag of stolen items slipping from his hand. Who said that?" Toby stammered, his voice barely audible. They turned slowly, their faces pale with fear. Standing at their back was a figure, a ghostly, human-like shape with glowing eyes. It was tall, dark, and shrouded in an eerie, unnatural mist. "Return my property," the figure thundered again, its voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Run," one of the boys screamed, and chaos erupted. The gang bolted for the door, their lanterns clattering to the floor. The bag of stolen goods lay forgotten as their panic consumed them. Toby reached the exit first, followed by the others, but Daniel lagged behind. As he neared the door, the ghostly figure raised its hand and struck. The force of the slap felt like a thunderclap, sending Daniel sprawling to the floor. "Ah, my ear! My ear!" he screamed, clutching the side of his head. His friends didn't stop to look back. They fled into the night, their footsteps fading into the distance. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his vision blurred and his legs weak. The room spun around him as he stumbled toward the door, his cries echoing in the stillness. He burst into the night, the cool air stinging his face. He ran blindly through the bushy paths, his cries growing fainter with each step. His legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. Finally, his strength gave out. He collapsed in the middle of a dirt path, his body motionless under the pale moonlight. The bodyguard at the mortuary, startled by the commotion, entered the room moments later. He found the bodies uncovered, the lanterns flickering on the floor, and a bag of valuables abandoned near the exit. "Who's been here?" he muttered, his voice tinged with fear. The guard quickly covered the bodies and retrieved the bag. At dawn, he planned to report the incident to the local authorities. Meanwhile, Daniel's absence from home had not gone unnoticed. Chief Ola, sensing something was terribly wrong, stayed up through the night. Waiting for his son to return, as the hours passed and his son still hadn't returned, his worry deepened. The sun rose gently over Olakan, casting long shadows across the bushy paths early in the morning. Two women, on their way to the stream, chatted in low tones. They carried empty pots on their heads and walked briskly, their eyes scanning the dirt road ahead. "Do you see that?" one of them whispered, halting mid-step. The other squinted. "What is it?" "Over there," she pointed to the path ahead. "It looks like a body." "A body?" The first woman's voice trembled. "What would a person be doing here, lying in the dirt at this hour?" "Let's go back." "This might be trouble," the second woman urged, her tone laced with fear. The first woman hesitated, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "What if he or she is hurt? We can't just leave." Reluctantly, the second woman followed. As they approached, their suspicions were confirmed. It was a young man, lying motionless on the ground. His clothes were rough, his face pale, and his eyes wide open, unblinking. "It's Daniel," one of them gasped, recognizing the notorious son of Chief Ola. The other woman's face drained of color. "What do we do? He's not dead, is he?" One of them knelt to check. "He's breathing, but barely. Go and fetch his father." Without a second thought, the woman dashed back toward the village, her pot forgotten on the roadside. Chief Ola, who had been pacing anxiously in his compound in worries, saw her approach. "Papa Daniel," she called out, breathless. "Come quickly. Your son is lying in the bush, motionless." Chief Ola froze, his heart skipping a beat. He had sensed something was wrong the night before when Daniel didn't return home. Now, his worst fears were confirmed. Grabbing his staff, he followed the woman at a hurried pace. When he arrived, he saw his son sprawled in the dirt, his usually bright face now pale and lifeless. Chief Ola dropped to his knees beside Daniel, his fingers trembling as he checked his son's pulse. "He's alive," Chief Ola muttered, though his voice carried little relief. "Help me carry him." With the women's assistance, Daniel was taken back to the compound and laid on a mat. Chief Ola wasted no time. He mixed herbs, ground powders, and rubbed black soap onto his son's body while muttering incantations. He called on the spirits, pleading for their mercy. "Spirits of the ancestors, hear me," he whispered, his voice heavy with desperation. "Do not take my son away. Spare him. Punish me if you must, but let him live." Daniel's chest rose and fell faintly, but his eyes remained unresponsive. His once defiant spirit was now reduced to a fragile, lifeless shell. Chief Ola's heart ached as he watched his son, his only child, lying so still. Villagers gathered outside the compound, whispering among themselves. Inside the compound, Chief Ola ignored their whispers. His focus was entirely on his son. He rubbed a thick black soap made of mystical ingredients over Daniel's body and blew smoke from burning herbs across his face. Occasionally, Daniel's body twitched, giving Chief Ola a glimmer of hope. But just as quickly, he would fall still again. As the days turned into nights, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Everyone in Olakan knew what had happened at the mortuary and they all suspected Daniel, but no one dared confront Chief Ola directly. Meanwhile, the authorities were busy investigating the break-in. The mortuary guard had reported everything he saw: the bodies left uncovered, the stolen items in the bag, and the commotion he had heard during the night. The local police took his statement and began their investigation. The police investigation, however, quickly started gaining traction. Following the trail of evidence, they discovered a single pair of palm slippers left behind at the scene. The worn-out footwear had been left behind during the gang's hasty escape. Inside Chief Ola's compound, days passed with no much significant improvement in Daniel's condition. The once vibrant and mischievous boy was now a shadow of himself. "You think my power can shield you from everything," Chief Ola muttered one night, speaking to his unconscious son. "I warned you, Daniel. I warned you that the spirits do not tolerate greed and disrespect." But even in his grief, he couldn't bring himself to stop fighting for his son's life. He continued mixing herbs, chanting incantations, and calling on the spirits to grant mercy. Weeks passed, and slowly, Daniel began to show signs of improvement. He could stand on his feet for short periods and even muttered his first coherent words one morning. However, his hearing and speech remained affected, leaving him unable to fully communicate. Still, to Chief Ola, it was progress. While Daniel fully recovered, one afternoon, the police arrived at the home of Toby, one of Daniel's closest accomplices. The palm slippers had been traced back to him, and under interrogation, Toby broke. "It was Daniel's idea," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. "He said we should rob the dead. It wasn't my fault." The police wasted no time. Armed with the confession, they arrested Toby and tracked down the other gang members, including Daniel. Chief Ola was in the middle of another ritual when the police arrived at his compound. Their stern expressions left no room for negotiation. "We're here for Daniel," one officer said firmly. Chief Ola looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. Chief Ola, though heartbroken, did not intervene this time. "Take him. Let the spirits teach him," he said quietly, as the officers led Daniel away. Daniel and his gang were sentenced to 1 year in prison for their crimes. For Daniel, prison was little more than a temporary setback. He showed no remorse. Instead, he brooded, his mind filled with bitterness and resentment. He thought of gaining power like his father's, to shield himself from any consequences. "If only I had my father's abilities," he muttered to himself. As the days turned into weeks, he began to plot. In his mind, the blame for his suffering fell on everyone. But himself, he vowed to never let anyone stand in his way again. When Daniel's prison sentence ended, he knew he could never return to Olakan. The shame and judgment in the villagers' eyes were too much for him to bear. Instead, he traveled to a neighboring town where his uncle lived. His uncle welcomed him with open arms, a kind and unsuspecting man who believed Daniel was ready to change. For a few weeks, Daniel behaved, keeping a low profile. But it wasn't long before his true nature resurfaced. He quickly befriended some of the local troublemakers and formed a new gang. Together, they began stealing livestock, breaking into homes, and selling the stolen goods in distant towns. The people of the town were bewildered as their belongings began to vanish without explanation. Livestock disappeared overnight, shops were broken into, and even sacred items from the local shrine went missing. "This has never happened before. We have a thief in our midst," the town chief declared during a community meeting. "Whoever is doing this will not escape punishment." Daniel, confident in his ability to evade suspicion, continued his crimes unchecked. One fateful day, news of a fatal accident spread through the town. The air was thick with heat, and the buzz of the town was interrupted by a loud crash echoing from the nearby road. Daniel, sitting on the steps of his uncle's house, heard the commotion and looked up. People were running toward the direction of the noise, shouting and gesturing wildly. "What's happening?" Daniel asked a passerby. "There's been an accident," the man replied. Rushing past him, Daniel hesitated for a moment before joining the crowd. The scene he encountered was chaotic. An overturned bus lay on its side, smoke rising from the engine. Passengers were trapped inside, some crying for help, others silent and still. The townspeople were working frantically to pull survivors out from the wreckage. Daniel stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. His face betrayed no emotion as he scanned the wreckage and the panicked crowd. Amid the chaos, something caught his eye: a man lying lifeless at the edge of a bush nearby. He appeared to have been thrown from the vehicle, his body crumpled unnaturally. Daniel's gaze darted around. No one was paying attention to the man. They were too busy rescuing the survivors. He walked slowly toward the bush, pretending to investigate the scene. When he reached the lifeless man, he bent down and quickly searched his pockets. His hands trembled as he pulled out a phone and a wallet. The wallet contained several crisp money notes, and the phone looked expensive. "This is too easy," Daniel muttered under his breath. He tucked the items into his pockets, glanced around once more, and casually walked away from the scene. As the crowd remained focused on the rescue efforts, Daniel slipped back to his uncle's house, satisfied with his newfound loot, unaware that his actions had sealed his fate. 2 days passed since the accident, and Daniel lounged in his uncle's compound, admiring the sleek phone he had stolen from the lifeless man. The wallet had already been emptied of its cash, and Daniel felt no guilt over his actions. "The dead don't need money or phones," he muttered, grinning to himself. He toyed with the phone, exploring its features and marveling at its value. It was the kind of possession he felt he deserved, without effort, without consequences. But Daniel's ignorance blinded him to the danger he had invited. It was a sunny afternoon when Daniel's fate unraveled. He sat under the mango tree in the compound, flipping through the phone's apps, unaware of the van that had pulled up outside. The air grew tense as the doors of the van slammed open, and 3 angry men stepped out. Their faces were hard, their expressions cold and unforgiving. They moved with purpose, heading straight for Daniel. "Where is he?" one of them barked, storming into the compound. Daniel's heart froze. He looked up, his mind screaming at him to run, but before he could react, the men surrounded him. "Don't play dumb, where is he?" one of them growled. I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel stammered, his voice trembling. The leader of the group stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "The phone. The wallet. Where did you get them?" Daniel's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. I found them," he stammered. "At the accident site. The man was already dead. I swear." But the men weren't convinced. One of them grabbed Daniel by the collar, shaking him violently. "Do you think we're fools? You'd better tell us where he is." "I'm telling the truth," Daniel cried, his voice breaking. "He's dead. I found him in the bushes." The leader exchanged a glance with his men, his expression cold and calculating. "Tie him up. Let's see if 3 days without food will make him speak." Unbeknownst to Daniel, the deceased man, whose items he had stolen, was not an ordinary person. He had been a member of a feared occultic group. Just before his death, the man had tried to leave the group and start a new life, defying their strict code of loyalty and betrayal. His decision had already angered the group, and they had warned him there was no escape. But his death had nothing to do with them, as they thought he was still alive and in hiding. The phone Daniel now flaunted was being tracked, its signal leading the group directly to him, and they believed Daniel had something to do with his whereabouts. Daniel was thrown into the back of their van, a sack tied over his head. The van sped off, its tires kicking up dust as it disappeared into the distance. Inside, Daniel's muffled cries filled the cramped space. He could feel the men's intimidating presence around him, their silence more terrifying than any threat. When they arrived at their hideout, a crumbling, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, he was dragged inside and tied to a chair. The sack was removed, and the men stared down at him with unrelenting eyes. "You have 3 days," the leader said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell us the truth, or you die." Daniel pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I swear, I'm not lying. I found the phone on a dead man. I don't know who he was." The men didn't believe him. Over the next 2 days, they starved him, beat him, and interrogated him relentlessly. Each time, his story remained the same, but their patience wore thinner with each passing hour. By the 3rd day, Daniel was weak and barely conscious. His body ached from the beatings, and his voice was hoarse from crying. The men decided he was too stubborn to cooperate. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel was dragged to a remote bush path. The cool evening air carried the scent of grass and distant fires, but for Daniel, the beauty of the sunset was lost. He knelt on the dirt, his hands bound, his head hanging low. The leader of the group stood at his front, a pistol gun in hand. "This is your last chance," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Where is he?" Daniel raised his tear-streaked face, his lips trembling. "I've told you everything. I swear." The leader sighed, raising the gun. "Then may the spirits judge you." The gunshot echoed through the stillness of the bush, followed by 2 more. Daniel's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The men left him there, disappearing into the shadows. Meanwhile, Daniel's uncle has been in search of him, his whereabouts has been questioned. Days passed before anyone discovered Daniel's body. By then, it had begun to decay, its smell attracting the attention of passers-by. When his uncle was called to the scene, he wept bitterly, barely recognizing his nephew. The news spread quickly, and it wasn't long before word reached Olakan. Chief Ola, upon hearing of his son's death, sat in stunned silence. The powerful witch doctor who could command rain and hold back storms was now just a grieving father. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I warned him. The spirits warned him." But he did not listen. The villagers of Olakan, though shocked, were unsurprised. Many whispered that Daniel's death was inevitable, a fitting punishment for his greed and arrogance. His body was buried in silence, without ceremony, and the people moved on, using his story as a warning for their children. The tale of Daniel became a lesson etched into the memories of all who heard it. It was a story of greed and recklessness, of the limits of power and the consequences of ignoring warnings. Even Chief Ola, for all his might, could not save his son from himself. And so, Daniel's story ended not with redemption or glory, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that some paths lead only to ruin. Please like and subscribe. It may look simple for you, but for us it's very valuable and it keeps us pushing to provide more interesting stories and tales, not just for your entertainment, but also for you to gain new experiences in life, to tackle new encounters. Thanks so much for your support.